In the depths of Alaska's wilderness, a mysterious plant waits. Its massive purple fruit looks alien, beautiful yet horrifying. When one hiker fell onto it, the fruit burst, spraying a toxic liquid that nearly destroyed. Well, we are going to get to that story here in a minute, so stay tuned. From deadly plants and strange creatures to unexplained disappearances, the Alaskan wilderness hides secrets that defy reason. In this episode, you'll hear firsthand accounts of encounters that will make you think twice about ever stepping foot in Alaska. Alaska is a land of extremes. Spanning over 663,000 square miles, it's larger than Texas, California, and Montana combined. With fewer than 2 people per square mile, it's one of the most remote places on Earth. But with isolation comes mystery. Every year, over 3,000 people vanish here, many without a trace. It's a place where legends run deep. Locals whisper about creatures like the Hairy Man, a Sasquatch-like beast said to stalk the forest, and the kushtaka, shape-shifting otter men from native lore who lure unsuspecting travelers to their doom. Then there's the Alaska Triangle, a region infamous for strange disappearances, UFO sightings, and electromagnetic anomalies that baffle scientists to this day. Even the land itself can feel alive. Towering mountains shrouded in mist, endless forests that swallow sound, and skies that dance with eerie lights. It's as if Alaska dares you to step too far. But sometimes, what you find when you do is far worse than what you could ever imagine. One of the most chilling stories I've come across involves a creature from Alaskan legend, the kushtaka, or shape-shifting otter man. These beings are said to lure people into the wilderness, never to return. I recently conducted an interview with someone who claims to have come face-to-face with one of these entities while camping deep in Alaska's backcountry. Here's their story.
It was mid-September, just before the snow really starts falling. I decided to go solo camping in the backcountry near the Copper River Basin. I've camped all over Alaska, so this wasn't anything new to me. But that night was different. The area felt off, and then when I set up camp, it was too quiet. Like, no birds, no wind. It was just really, really silent. I brushed it off, figured maybe the wildlife was keeping their distance because of me. So I set up my tent near this creek. I built a fire and just tried to relax a little bit. Around midnight, I heard something. It was the sound of water splashing. At first, I don't know, thought it was some fish, a beaver, or something like that. But then I realized it was too rhythmic, like too deliberate. Like something walking in the water. So I grabbed my flashlight and I scanned the creek, and that's when I saw it. At first it looked like an otter, big. Like really big. Bigger than any otter I've ever seen. It was standing halfway out of the water, just watching me. Its eyes, though, they were like too large. It was like almost human-like. I remember feeling it just felt so weird looking at this thing. I tried to convince myself it was just a big otter, but then it stands up on 2 legs. And it wasn't an otter anymore. Its body was stretched, like elongated, almost like it was shedding its skin. Within seconds, I was looking at something that resembled a man, but not quite. Its arms were like too long. Its legs were like bending backwards, like a predator's. And its face, it still had that otter-like snout, but its teeth were like all wrong. But it looked too sharp and too many of them. It just stared at me for a moment, like tilting its head like it was trying to like size me up. and then it started moving toward me, slow at first, like it was testing my reaction. Well, I panicked. I grabbed my flare gun and I shot it into the air, hoping to scare it off. It flinched and then it let out this awful scream, and then it dropped right back into the creek. Needless to say, I didn't sleep at all that night. I packed up my camp and waited for daylight. As soon as it was light enough, I hiked out of there as fast as I possibly could. And the weird part is when I got back to the main trailhead, I checked the map and I realized that the creek wasn't even marked. It was like this place didn't even exist. Look, I know what I saw. I've spent my whole life in the outdoors, and I've never seen anything like that. Whatever it was unnatural. Now, I've heard stories about the kushtaka, the shape-shifting otter men, but I never believed them. Now, I'm not so sure.
Wow, that is the first kushtaka encounter we have had on the channel. Let me know in the comments what you think about that encounter. Up next, we have another interview with someone who was staying with their uncle in Alaska and saw something they never expected. Here's the interview.
This happened a few years back when I was staying with my uncle just outside of Anchorage, Alaska. So he's got this cabin out in the woods. It's about 30 minutes from the main road. It's not completely off-grid, but close enough that you feel like you're in the middle of nowhere. I'd gone up there to help him out for just a couple weeks while he was recovering from knee surgery. Just like chopping wood, fixing things around the cabin, and running errands in town. So one afternoon, I went out to chop some firewood. In my uncle's cabin, it sits in this clearing, but the woods just start right at the edge of the property, and they're thick. I mean, you can't see more than a few feet into them before everything turns into shadows. Anyway, I grabbed the axe and headed to the wood pile, which is about 20 yards from the cabin, near the edge of the tree line. It was cold, but not freezing, and everything was quiet except for the sound of the axe hitting the wood. I must have been out there for about 20 minutes when I got that feeling, you know, like someone's watching you. At first, didn't pay that much attention to it. And then I figured it was just my imagination, or I don't know, maybe something moving around in the trees. But then I noticed how quiet it had gotten. And it was just me and the sound of the axe hitting that wood. I stopped just to look around, and that's when I saw it, just inside the tree line. You know, probably about 15 feet away. At first, I thought it was just like this big dog. A wolf or a dog, I don't know. And then it stood up. It was tall. I mean, if this thing was really tall, it had to be at least as tall as I was, and I'm like 6 more. And it had these long arms and legs. Its body looked like it was stretched out, like too tight, with like muscles ripping under its skin. The head was the thing that really got me, though. It looked like a wolf or a dog with pointed ears and a long snout, but its eyes, they weren't animal eyes. They were way too yellow and way too human-like. And man, it was so freaky. I didn't know if I should run or just stay still. I was kind of just like frozen right there with fear. So my mind's racing, and I'm trying to make sense of what the hell I'm seeing. And it's like making its head go just a little bit sideways, like it's like checking me out. Like it was like curious to like what it was doing and what I was doing. And then it takes a step towards me, and it's got these like bent legs like a dog, but it's like walking. I don't know. It was so weird. It was almost like it was testing how far it could go before I reacted. Well, I don't even remember dropping the axe, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, I'm sprinting as fast as I can back to the cabin. Slam the door shut, lock it, even though, I mean, what's that gonna do? This thing was just massive. My uncle's inside sitting on the couch, and he's looking at me like I'm crazy, and he's like, "What's wrong with you?" I tried to explain what I saw, but it sounds so ridiculous as I was saying it. A giant man-dog thing in the woods. He just shook his head. Probably just a bear. They stand up sometimes, you know. That's what he says. But I knew what I saw, it was not a bear. I didn't go back outside that night, and the next morning I still found the axe laying right by the woodpile. There were tracks around it, but they weren't from any animal I recognized. They were huge. They were like wolf tracks, but bigger. I don't know what it was, and honestly, I don't want to know. So I left my uncle's place a few days later, and I haven't been back since. I've talked to him since then, and he hasn't seen anything. And I hope it stays that way, because I definitely don't want my uncle dealing with that.
I recently received an email from a listener, and I've got to share it with you because it's absolutely insane. Deep in Alaska's wilderness, they stumbled upon a strange plant with massive purple fruit, and someone ended up in the hospital. Let me know in the comments below what you think about this story. A few years ago, my friends and I took a long-anticipated trip to Alaska. We were all outdoor enthusiasts from Ohio, itching to experience the untouched wilderness we'd only heard about. It felt like the ultimate adventure. Our plan was simple: a week-long hiking trip through the rugged landscape. We prepared meticulously: gear, research, and a route planned to the smallest detail. For the first few days, everything was perfect. The scenery was breathtaking and our spirits high. But on the third day, everything changed. While trekking through dense forest, we stumbled upon a strange clearing. It wasn't particularly large, but it stood out. In the middle was a purple bush unlike anything we'd ever seen. It was short, barely knee-high, and covered in enormous fruit-like growths, each as big as a volleyball. The fruit had a glossy sheen, almost translucent, and inside we could see what looked like sacs filled with a thick white liquid. The sight was eerie but fascinating. Being the most curious, or reckless, of the group, I decided to get a closer look. As I moved toward the bush, my boot caught on a root hidden beneath the grass. I stumbled forward and landed hard on my shin, right on one of the strange fruits. The impact burst it open, spraying the white liquid everywhere, including on my leg. The pain was immediate and intense, like acid eating into my skin. I scrambled back, shouting for help, while my friends rushed to see what had happened. The liquid seemed to cling to my skin, and within moments, the area around the impact was red, swollen, and burning. We used our first aid kit to clean the liquid off as best we could, and bandaged the wound, but the pain didn't subside. As we debated what to do, we noticed the liquid seeping from the other fruits on the bush, as if the plant itself was reacting to the disturbance. It was unnerving. By the next morning, the swelling on my shin had worsened dramatically. The skin had turned an angry shade of purple, and I could barely walk. My friends helped me limp along, but we all realized we had no choice but to cut the trip short and head back. The wilderness that had seemed so majestic now felt hostile. The journey back was grueling. The pain in my leg grew unbearable, and I was barely conscious by the time we reached the trailhead. My friends rushed me to the nearest hospital, where the doctors were stunned by what they saw. The wound on my shin wasn't just swollen, it was necrotic, the tissue rapidly dying. Tests revealed an aggressive infection caused by an unknown substance. The doctors speculated that the liquid contained a combination of toxins and bacteria, unlike anything they'd encountered. I spent days in the hospital undergoing treatments to stop the infection. Thankfully, they saved my leg, but I was left with permanent scarring as a reminder of that horrific encounter. After I was discharged, my friends returned to the clearing, hoping to find the bush and report it to authorities. But when they arrived, the clearing was unrecognizable. The bush was gone, and the area looked as though it had never been disturbed. There was no trace of the strange fruit or the liquid that had caused so much damage. To this day, I have no explanation for what we encountered. The scar on my leg is a constant reminder of how little we understand about the natural world. If you ever find yourself in the wilderness, remember this: not everything you see can or should be explained. And sometimes, curiosity can cost you more than you're prepared to lose. Now I have one more interview of an encounter that took place outside of Anchorage. Here it is.
First, I just want to say thanks for letting me tell my story. So, I grew up in Eagle River. It's about 15 miles outside of Anchorage. My family's been here for generations, back before it was even called Eagle River. My dad, Rick, he was the kind of guy that everybody knew around town. Hardworking, quiet, but when he told a story, people listened. He wasn't the type to exaggerate or to make things up, which is why the story he told me stuck with me my entire life. He passed away a few years ago, but I'll never forget the way that he talked about what happened to him when he was a young man. He told the story the same way every time, like he wanted to make sure he got every detail right. This happened back in the 70s, when my dad was in his early 20s. Back then, he worked a lot of logging jobs, clearing out land for new developments. One job took him way out to this lake north of Eagle River. If you've ever been out there, you know that it's very isolated. It's beautiful, mountains, forests, and the lake, but it's quiet too. The kind of quiet that gets under your skin if you're out there too long. Anyway, my dad and his buddy Mike were hired to clear out a small patch of forest by the lake. They were staying in this old hunting cabin that belonged to the guy who owned the land. It wasn't much, just 4 walls and a stove, but it was better than sleeping in a tent. They'd work all day, cutting trees, hauling logs, and then they headed back to the cabin for the night. The first couple of nights were normal. They'd cook dinner, talk about the job, and then turn in early. But on the third night, Dad said he started feeling off. He couldn't explain it, but he felt like something was out there. He didn't say anything to Mike. He figured it was just his imagination. That night, though, something woke him up. It was a sound, this low growl, almost like a bear, but a lot deeper. He sat up and listened, and then he heard footsteps outside the cabin, like heavy ones. Like whatever it was had a lot of weight to it. He said the footsteps didn't sound like a bear either. They were slow and deliberate, like something was walking on 2 legs. So Dad grabbed the shotgun, they kept by the door, and he shook Mike awake. They sat there listening as the footsteps circled the cabin. Every now and then they'd hear that growl again. Mike whispered to my dad, maybe it's just a bear. But Dad shook his head. He knew it wasn't a bear. Then the footsteps stopped. They sat there for what felt like hours, but nothing happened. Finally, they started to relax, thinking whatever it was had just taken off. But just as Dad was about to put the shotgun down, something hit the side of the cabin hard. It was like a truck slammed into the side of the cabin. The whole cabin shook. Mike started yelling, "What the hell was that?" Dad didn't want to wait to find out. He threw open the door, shotgun ready, stepped outside. He said it was pitch black. The moon lit up the clearing just enough to see something standing there at the edge of the trees. He never called it a creature or a monster. He just said it was big, taller than any man he'd ever seen, with these long, gangly arms and this hunched over posture. Its eyes reflected the moonlight, glowing this weird yellow color. Dad didn't think, he just shot into the air. The thing didn't move at first, like it was trying to figure him out. Then it let out this howl. He said it didn't sound like anything that he'd ever heard before. It wasn't a wolf or a bear or anything natural. The thing backed into the trees and disappeared. But Dad said that he didn't sleep that night. He and Mike just packed up the next morning and told the landowner that they were finishing the job. He didn't care if he got paid or not. He just wanted to get the hell out of there.
And now this is the last story, and it was sent to me in an email. Ever since I can remember, I've had a thing for the great outdoors. There's just something about the rugged beauty of nature that always called out to me. So, when my buddy Mike and I got the chance to do a hiking trip in Alaska, we jumped on the opportunity without giving it a second thought. We flew into Anchorage, stocked up on supplies, and hit the trails. The vast emptiness of the Alaskan wilderness was breathtaking. The snow-covered peaks, the pine trees, and the clear blue skies. It was all just so overwhelming. Mike and I, we had been down this road before. We'd done hikes in the Appalachians, in the Rockies, even in the Swiss Alps. But Alaska, it was different. The wilderness there was pristine, untouched, and yet also so unforgiving. We started our hike at the trailhead near a small town about 100 miles from Anchorage. The first day was pretty exhausting. We had to navigate our way through dense forests, across gushing streams, and up steep ridges. But the exhaustion was worth it. It was just pure, unadulterated adventure. And that's why we were here, wasn't it? The thrill of exploration, the camaraderie of the journey, the solace of the wilderness. It was all part of the package. Our plan was to hike up to a small glacial lake located about 6 miles from the trailhead. We would camp there for the night and then make our way back the next day. As we trekked our way through the wilderness, we would often stop to soak in our surroundings. As the day wore on, we started to feel the strain of the journey, the weight of our backpacks, the constant uphill climb. It was definitely taking a toll on our bodies. But we pushed on, adrenaline and excitement driving us forward. We stopped for a quick lunch break. As afternoon turned to evening, we finally reached our destination. The glacial lake was a stunning sight. Surrounded by snow-capped peaks and dense pine forests, the lake shimmered in the evening light. We set up camp on the lake's shore, cooked up some dinner, and then just sat there, taking in the beauty of our surroundings. As the night fell, we huddled around our campfire, sharing stories and laughs. As we were sitting around the campfire, that's when we first felt it, an uneasiness, a sort of pressure that you couldn't quite put your finger on. Mike looked at me, and I could see the same concern reflected in his eyes. "Feel that?" I asked, and he just nodded. At first, we thought it was just the altitude getting to us. But then, we realized it wasn't just a feeling. The air around us seemed to be vibrating, humming with a kind of energy that I had never felt before. The fire suddenly sputtered as if a gust of wind had blown through it. But the air was still. The trees around us seemed to lean away, their branches shuddering. We stood up. As we turned around, that's when we saw it. In the middle of our camp, a shimmering field of energy stood tall. It wasn't a physical barrier. You could walk around it, but it seemed to bend light around itself in a way that made it hard to see what was on the other side. The glow was radiant, captivating in a terrifying way. We approached it, cautiously, our hearts pounding in our chests. I reached out, my hands shaking, to touch the barrier. As soon as my fingers made contact, a jolt of energy shot through me. It didn't hurt, but it was powerful. It was like the force field was alive and aware of us. We spent the night trying to understand this phenomenon. We walked around it, threw rocks at it, even tried to dig under it, but nothing worked. The force field stood firm, impenetrable and unyielding. Despite our efforts, we were no closer to understanding what it was or why it was there. As dawn started to break, we decided to call it a night. We were tired, confused, and a little scared. We packed up our stuff and decided to head back. But as we were leaving, I looked back one last time. The force field was still there. To this day, I cannot explain what we experienced that night. I remember the fear, the anticipation, the excitement, and the disappointment. I remember the feeling of being so close to something so extraordinary, yet unable to comprehend it.